Okay, let's talk about scope triggering. The oscilloscope isn't showing you just a single instance of the input waveform. It's drawing the input waveform from left to right over 250 microseconds times 10 divisions, which in this case is 2.5 milliseconds. It then redraws it, and as long as the waveform is the same and we always start drawing at the same place, what we see is a very stable image. If we don't start at the same place, what we see is a waveform that's moving because we're starting sometimes at the bottom, the middle, the top. That's known as not triggered. We have a button that says set to 50% in the trigger section. If we press that button, that automatically selects a trigger that works most of the time. We also have a knob called the level that allows us to select where on the waveform we trigger, and that's the point where we start. In this case, this yellow arrow here tells you you're triggering on channel 1, and it tells you at what point you're triggering. The trigger right now is shown by this arrow here. See, it says green triggered, T-I-R-I-G-D. There's a vertical arrow that says this is the trigger point, and that will be at whatever voltage this shows. So if I move this down towards the bottom, we start the waveform right at that level. We move it to the top, we start the waveform at that voltage level. Now it's important that we always trigger on channel 1. We have a button over here called Trigger Menu that gives us a menu here. We got whether we trigger on an edge, we can trigger on some external type signal. In this case, this scope is smart enough to know what video signals work like. We can trigger on pulses of certain widths. Edge is the only one we're going to use in this course. We can select our source. Now, if we trigger on channel 2 and there's no channel 2, channel 1 is not going to be triggered. That's very frustrating. In this course, we're always going to use our scope probe on channel 1 first, and we're going to leave our trigger on channel 1. We can trigger on the rising edge of our waveform or the falling edge of our waveform. In general, we're going to trigger in auto mode. That means that if there is no trigger, we still see something. If we're in normal mode and there's no trigger, what we see is an old waveform. So if we suddenly have a trigger, we see an old waveform, and even if there was nothing coming in, we'd still see something. So auto mode, edge triggered, channel 1. DC coupling, AC coupling, once again, we're going to leave it on DC coupling. It makes the most sense. So I'm going to hit the set to 50%, and we're back to our channel triggered. So the important thing to remember is always use channel 1 first, always leave our trigger on channel 1, and if you don't get a trigger, press the set to 50% button, and you should get a nice stable waveform.